It was a crisp autumn morning in 1955 when Rachel Weisz stepped onto the narrow walkway leading to her new home. The suburban street looked like a postcard, neatly trimmed hedges, uniform white picket fences, and identical homes lined up like soldiers at attention. To anyone else, it might have seemed idyllic, but to Rachel, it felt like a facade, too neat to be trusted. The air was too quiet, too sterile. She wasn't here by choice, but by necessity. Her past, rooted in unspeakable tragedy, had brought her to America in search of stability. What she hadn't expected was for her past to confront her so vividly, in the unlikeliest of places. Across the street, an older man with a rigid posture and an icy demeanor stood watching as Rachel and the movers unloaded her modest belongings. He didn't smile or wave, just observed, his face a mask. The neighbor next door leaned over the fence, whispering to Rachel conspiratorially. "That's Karl Richards. Keeps to himself. Retired, I think. Bit of a strange one." Rachel nodded, offering a polite smile, but as Karl's piercing gaze lingered on her for a beat too long, an unease stirred in her chest. There was something unsettling about him. His stance, the way he carried himself, it triggered a memory she couldn't quite place, a shadow from a time she had tried to forget, but never could. Rachel had survived Auschwitz. She had endured years of starvation, degradation, and the loss of everyone she had ever loved. She wore her survival like armor, her sharp wit and unyielding resilience warding off pity. But as she watched Karl from her kitchen window in the days that followed, unease gnawed at her. There was something too familiar about him. The way he smoked his cigarette with the same mechanical movements she had seen so many times in the camps. The stiff way he greeted others as though formality was a shield. Her unease turned into curiosity, and curiosity into quiet obsession. Who was this man? Where had he been during the war? Why did her gut twist every time their eyes met? It happened on a chilly November evening. Rachel was coming home from the corner market when she dropped her bag of apples on the sidewalk. Karl was there, seemingly out of nowhere, stooping to help her gather the scattered fruit. Up close, his face seemed carved from stone, his blue eyes cold and calculating. "Thank you," Rachel said stiffly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. He nodded curtly. "No trouble." His accent, faint but unmistakable, sent a shiver down her spine. German. It was faint, barely noticeable, but to her ears, it was as loud as a siren. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, her tone casual but her words carefully chosen. "Long enough," he replied, straightening and handing her the last apple. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I prefer the quiet." Rachel held his gaze, trying to glean something more, but he tipped his hat and walked away before she could ask another question. That night, her dreams were filled with haunting images of uniformed men, barking orders, and the skeletal faces of prisoners, each screaming for justice. Rachel's suspicions consumed her. She began watching Karl more closely, noting the little details that made her skin crawl. The precision of his routines, the harsh bark of his voice when he spoke to delivery men, the cold efficiency with which he maintained his lawn. She had met men like him before, calculating, disciplined, and unfeeling. One day, as she passed by his home, she noticed something in his garage, a locked trunk, partially obscured under a tarp. Her heart raced as an impulsive thought overtook her. That trunk could hold answers, or confirmation of her fears. Under the cover of night, Rachel crept into Karl's yard. The garage door was slightly ajar, as though fate had left it open for her. She slipped inside, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The trunk was heavy, and the lock resisted her efforts at first. But when it finally popped open, her heart stopped. Inside were faded photographs of Karl. Only it wasn't Karl Richards. It was Kurt Reinhardt, a Nazi officer in full uniform, standing beside others at a concentration camp. Beside the photos were yellowed documents and a stack of letters in German, each stamped with the Nazi insignia. Rachel's hands trembled as she flipped through them, her stomach churning with rage and horror. She had found her answer, and it was worse than she had imagined. The next morning, Rachel stormed across the street and banged on Karl's door. He opened it cautiously, his expression neutral, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "You lied," she hissed, thrusting one of the photographs into his chest. "You think you can hide behind a new name and a picket fence? I know who you are, Kurt Reinhardt." Karl's face paled, and for the first time, his composure cracked. He tried to shut the door, but Rachel shoved her foot in the way. "You don't get to run away from this," she shouted, her voice shaking with anger. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Let me explain." Rachel glared at him, her fury barely contained. "You'll explain to the world," she spat. "I'll make sure of it." As she turned to leave, Karl called after her, his voice tinged with desperation. "Rachel, wait! You don't know the whole story." She stopped but didn't turn around. "You have no story I want to hear," she said coldly. "Your actions already spoke loud enough." But even as she walked away, her mind swirled with questions. What exactly was his story? And why, despite her anger, did she feel an unsettling need to hear it? The days that followed were a whirlwind of rage and resolve for Rachel. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat without the shadow of her discovery clouding her thoughts. The photograph of Karl, no, Kurt, haunted her. She remembered faces like his, officers barking orders, their icy stares devoid of empathy. He had been one of them, a cog in the machine that had stolen her family and nearly destroyed her. Rachel wasn't about to let him continue his life of deceit. She began compiling evidence, starting with the photographs and documents she had found in his garage. Her plan was simple: expose him. She reached out to a local journalist she had met at a synagogue event, explaining the situation. He was immediately intrigued. "If this man is who you say he is, this could blow the lid off a lot of things," he said. "But Rachel, are you sure you're ready for what this will bring? It won't just be his life that changes." Her resolve hardened. "I owe it to the people who can no longer speak for themselves," she replied. "This man has lived in peace while we've carried the weight of what he helped create." Karl's desperation to tell his story. Across the street, Karl, or Kurt, was a man unraveling. He had spent decades hiding in plain sight, adopting a new name and identity after the war. His quiet life in the suburbs had been his sanctuary, a world away from the horrors he had witnessed and committed. But Rachel's confrontation had shaken him to his core. The cold, calculating officer within him wanted to deny everything, to shut the door on his past once again. But there was another part of him, a guilt-ridden man who had never truly escaped the weight of his choices. One evening, as Rachel sat on her porch, Karl approached, his hands trembling. "Please, Rachel," he said, his voice breaking. "I know you hate me, and you have every right to. But let me tell you my side." She stared at him, her jaw tight. "You have nothing to say that I want to hear." But Karl wouldn't leave. "I'm not who you think I am. Yes, I was there, but it's not what you think. Please give me one chance to explain." Rachel's instinct screamed at her to turn him away, but a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even pity, made her pause. "Tomorrow," she said curtly, "you have one chance." The next day, Karl invited Rachel into his home. The inside was meticulously clean, yet sterile, devoid of warmth. He led her to the living room and handed her a cup of tea, his hands shaking as he placed the saucer down. "I was 21 when I joined the army," he began, his voice heavy with shame. "At first, I thought I was serving my country, my family. But then," he trailed off, his eyes distant. Rachel's expression was icy. "You thought you were doing your duty by murdering innocent people?" Karl flinched. "I never wanted to be part of that," he said quietly. "When I realized what was happening, it was too late. I tried to leave, but desertion meant death. I was a coward. I stayed." Rachel scoffed. "Do you expect me to pity you because you were afraid? My parents were marched into gas chambers, Karl. My little sister starved to death in my arms. Where was your fear then?" He bowed his head, tears streaming down his face. "I can't change what I was, but I tried to help where I could. I snuck food to prisoners. I falsified paperwork to delay deportations. He choked on his words. "It wasn't enough. It will never be enough." As Karl spoke, Rachel's fury began to tangle with confusion. Could it be possible that this man, who had been part of the machinery of her suffering, had also tried to mitigate it? Or was he simply spinning a story to absolve himself? The photographs she had found painted him as a monster, but the man sitting before her seemed shattered, haunted by his past. She left his home feeling more conflicted than ever. That night, she pulled out the evidence she had gathered, laying it out on her kitchen table. The journalist called her, eager for an update. "So, are we moving forward?" he asked. Rachel hesitated. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. "There's more to this than I thought." Word of Rachel and Karl's tense interactions began to spread through the neighborhood. People whispered behind curtains, speculating about what was happening between the Holocaust survivor and the reclusive German man. One neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, approached Rachel at the grocery store. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked, feigning concern. "We've noticed some tension." Rachel stared her down. "If you want to know, ask him," she said curtly. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more intrusive. Karl, too, felt the weight of the neighborhood's scrutiny. One day, as he retrieved his mail, a group of teenage boys shouted at him from the sidewalk. "Hey, Nazi, got any skeletons in your basement?" The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they hit too close to home. Rachel's doubt began to crack when a package arrived at her door. Inside was a letter, written in German, and a faded photograph of a young girl wearing a yellow star. The letter was from Karl. In it,